And now, the best 60-ish seconds of your week. This week, President Trump's former consigliere, Michael Cohen, went to prison, at least in part because of campaign finance violations. Historically and traditionally, campaign finance violations have not risen to criminal charges or criminal convictions. If you want to take a look back, view the case of John Edwards, former Democratic nominee for vice president and himself a presidential contender, and see what happened in that case. Because now there's some chortling and chirping by some on the left about whether or not the Cohen situation extends into the White House and touches the president himself. This much is pretty clear. A sitting president can't be indicted for these types of things. Whether or not it is a high crime and misdemeanor to have campaign finance violations is another issue altogether, because that's a question involving impeachment. Impeachment is not a legal issue, it's a political one. And the question is, are there enough votes to impeach the president of the United States, particularly over issues like campaign finance violations? I don't think there are, but if at some point there might be, it's pretty clear equally that there aren't enough votes to remove him in a Senate trial. So the Democrats would know full well that they were putting the nation through a very protracted and painful process, knowing what the final result was going to be. And even if they got their wish, that they'd have Mike Pence as president of the United States. So you've got to wonder where their thinking really is on that, and how much Nancy Pelosi is willing to placate the far left in her caucus. But if you watch that little tete-a-tete between the president and leaders Schumer and Pelosi this week, you might wonder how much of that was posturing for the television cameras. You can decide for yourself. But there clearly isn't a warm and fuzzy relationship right now on the eve of the new session of Congress. And how much thawing out takes place over the cold days of winter remains to be seen. Meanwhile, the economy continues to be on the front pages of the newspaper, particularly what's going to happen in 2019 leading into the 2020 elections. And there are some serious concerns. The market, for example, and again, we've warned that market prices and stock prices don't equate with political success, but the markets are an indicator of what's going on. And they were in free fall a week ago, largely because of the tariff issue. This week, they recouped some of their losses, but not nearly enough to get back to their original position. Midweek, there was an indication that the vote of no confidence in Great Britain over Theresa May might, because of the stability that it would yield, boost the markets upward again. That announcement came just as the American markets were closing on Wednesday, and Thursday there was a slight uptick, but a really pretty tepid response. So whether or not that will yield what the prognosticators thought, again, remains to be seen. And there are issues in the housing market here in the United States. But if you look beneath the numbers there, it's very interesting. It appears to be a bi-coastal situation where big cities in California, Seattle, Washington, for example, have problems, as do major metropolitan areas on the East Coast. But in quote-unquote flyover territory, in many of those red states, the economy is doing just fine, percolating upward, and housing is equally in pretty good shape. So an awful lot of this now boils down to a discussion of the Fed. And before we get to that, the yield curve analysis that continues, where there's a flattening of the yield curve and some talk now about actual inversion, which would indicate recession and certainly would give rise to concerns about a worldwide economic slowdown. But the Fed, which has been manipulating markets for a long time through buying bonds and the fact that they can in fact print money, and that always gave a question about inflation control, is now back in the news in a big way. And an awful lot of folks that hadn't traditionally asked this question are asking whether or not we actually need a Federal Reserve. A little bit over 100 years old. Some people say it still needs to be the lender of last resort, but whether or not its functionality and purpose is truly necessary, I think is going to be a question that gets asked by a larger number of people in the next session of Congress and in the days ahead. So that'll be something very interesting to watch. And for now, that is the best 60-ish seconds of your week.